Section 3.4, diffusion and osmosis, otherwise known as passive transport. Passive transport is the movement of molecules or particles or ions into or out of a cell without the cell using any energy. There's two categories: simple diffusion or facilitated diffusion. Simple diffusion means it goes through relatively easy. That would be a particle that's going directly through the cell membrane from outside to inside the cell. Where facilitated diffusion would be diffusion with help or with facilitation. Okay, this would be like using a channel protein to get a particle to move from outside the cell to inside the cell. Okay, so simple diffusion or facilitated diffusion. Facilitated means diffusion with help. Some key terms that you need to know for this section. First is concentration gradient. Concentration gradient is the difference in concentrations of particles throughout space. We'll get more into this in a second. Space just meaning the area in the cell or in the cell membrane or in the cytoplasm. Okay, diffusion is movement of particles from an area of high concentration to low concentration. I'm just saying particles which be representative of molecules, ions, substances from high concentration to low. Concentration to low concentration. And an equilibrium where the concentrations are the same throughout space or the same on one side of the membrane to the other. Okay, so concentrations are equal. Concentrations of substances or particles equal throughout space, and this could be either from the inside cell to the outside of the cell or in the cytoplasm itself or in a solution itself where things are distributed equally throughout. So I'm just going to use space to say that. Okay, so concentration gradient. Okay, concentration gradient is the difference in concentrations from one location to another or throughout space. When there are more dissolved particles in one location compared to another. So we have a couple examples here. This represents the cell membrane. Okay, so as you can see, there are quite a bit more particles on this side of the membrane than on this side, which would make this concentration higher and this concentration lower, concentration of particles dissolved in the solvent. Okay, here, this is a sugar cube that's sitting in a beaker of water, and because the sugar cube hasn't dissolved yet, the concentration of sugar is very high here and not so much over here throughout the rest of the solution. Over time, this will diffuse and it will become equally dispersed throughout the solution where it will be at equilibrium. Same thing with the colored dyes here, the food dyes. When you first drop them in, they're gonna just kind of go in there. It'll be much more concentrated here of that greenish blue color and much more concentrated here. And then obviously in this area, very little particles. Over time, these things will go to equilibrium where they'll be equally distributed throughout. So diffusion is the movement of molecules from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. Going high to low is said to be moving down the concentration gradient. And this is a result of the natural movement of the particles. Remember, all atoms, all molecules are vibrating, so they're going to be vibrating, so they will move right here when it first goes in. This is pretty concentrated here, but over time they start spreading out until eventually they get equally distributed throughout the entire solution. just like with this dropper of dye. They put a drop of dye in this solution. It's very concentrated in this area when it first goes in. Over time it starts slowly dispersing till it gets equally distributed throughout the beaker of water. Equilibrium is when dissolved molecules are equally spread or spaced out throughout the solution they're in. This is what diffusion wants to go to. Its goal is to reach equilibrium. So if there was a high concentration of particles on this side of the membrane and they were able to diffuse through, over time, what would happen would be the concentration on this side of the membrane and on this side of the membrane would be the same. They would be equal, and the solutions would be said to be at equilibrium. Simple diffusion is when molecules move from areas of high concentration to their low concentration directly through the cell membrane. This requires no energy input from the cell. No energy from the cell. Okay, which is why it's called passive transport. This happens with small molecules and nonpolar molecules, because both small and nonpolar molecules can fit between the phospholipid molecules that make up the cell membrane. These guys can just pass right through. Okay, they're small enough so they fit in the space, and they're nonpolar, so they're not attracted to the polar side and repelled by the nonpolar side of the phospholipid, and they can pass through the cell membrane. So simple diffusion is movement from high concentration to low concentration directly through the cell membrane. An example of something that you guys would know about that does this is when we breathe, we take in oxygen into our lungs through the air we breathe. The concentration of oxygen is much higher than in our lungs than in the red blood cells. That would be in the alveoli, or the air sacs in the lungs. And as a result, oxygen would diffuse into the red blood cells. Just the opposite is happening with CO2. CO2 is higher inside the red blood cells than in your lungs. So CO2 would diffuse out of the red blood cells, and you'd get rid of the carbon dioxide when you exhale. So you're breathing in air to get a high concentration of oxygen within your lungs. Oxygen goes into the red blood cells, and at the same time, the CO2 concentration inside the red blood cells is higher than in your lungs. CO2 goes out, and this is part of our respiration process. Facilitated diffusion is diffusion with help. It says it's the same idea as simple diffusion, when molecules move from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration without energy be required by the cell. So it's still passive transport, but because of the size, shape, or charge of the molecules, they have to go through transport proteins. They can't pass directly through the membrane, so they need help. They need help of these proteins. Again, large or polar molecules are going to need help getting into the cell. They can either be something like this, which is a channel protein. These guys are just open all the time. So this molecule would have the correct charge, size, and shape to go through this pore and get into the cell. This type of protein is what's called a carrier protein, and it is also specific for this molecule. Right now it's shown in the opening into the cell orientation. When this substance is not in here, this thing will be open to the outside and closed on the inside. This would fit directly in here. The carrier protein would change shape, and the molecule would pass into the cell through this transport protein, or this carrier protein. Osmosis is facilitated diffusion of a specific substance called water. Okay, water moves from areas of high water concentration to areas of low water concentration through a transport protein. Requires no energy from the cell, and so it's passive transport. Okay, what does it mean from high water concentration? Well, if we have most things that are dissolved in water, and say, for example, if it was salt, so we have sodium ions and chloride ions in the salt water. If there was a little bit of salt in it, that would mean there would be a lot of water. If there was a lot of salt in it, that means there would be less water. So high concentration of water means low concentration of solute. And a low concentration of water means a high concentration of solute. So you need to understand that. So when we talk about which direction things move, you'll know why. Okay, so like I was saying, with concentrations, right? Remember, most things in the body are dissolved in water. Most solutions are made with water as the solvent. Okay, this is a red blood cell. Okay, in an isotonic solution, the concentration of these particles, whatever they are the same as they would be inside the cell. Okay, so the concentration outside the cell and inside the cell would be the same. And what would happen would be these particles are moving in and moving out at the same rate. Therefore, this would be what's called an isotonic solution. Concentrations are the same inside and outside. Now, the particles are still moving, okay, in and out. They're just moving in at the same rate. So that's why it's at equilibrium, or more specifically, dynamic equilibrium. Okay, this next one. Here, there's much less particles outside the cell than inside the cell. So in order to balance this out, water is going to go into the cell, not the particles, because there's already a bunch in there, but water is going to go into the cell. And what will happen is this cell will swell up. It's taking on water, because in this case, the solution out here is hypotonic, so it has less particles, which means more water outside the cell than inside, and the water concentrations want to balance out, so water would move in and the cell is going to swell up. And this last concentration, or this last, okay, and this is called a hypotonic solution. More water than solute would be hypotonic. This last example, there is a lot of particles outside the cell, so it's very concentrated with particles. A lot of stuff dissolved in the water, so very little water in the solution outside the cell. And what's going to happen is water is going to come out of the cell. Okay? Because if there's a high amount of dissolved particles in the solution around the cell, that solution is said to be hypertonic. Okay? So lots of particles, which means less water outside of the cell. So water will go out to try and balance it out, and the cell is going to shrink. Here this is illustrated again, a hypertonic solution. Remember, hypertonic, more particles outside than inside. And as a result, water is going to move out to dilute the substances outside and get the concentration roughly the same. So water is going to go out, and as a result, the cell shrinks. In this case, a hypotonic solution, meaning the solution has a much higher concentration of water, the solution outside the cell, much higher concentration of water because very few particles in it. And as a result, water would move in. Okay, less particles outside the cell than inside the cell, meaning more water outside the cell than inside the cell. Water would move in and the cell would swell up. Lastly, an isotonic solution, the cell and the solution around the cell have the same concentration of water, the same amount of water inside and outside the cell. So water moves out and water moves in, and it moves in at the same rate, so the cell size remains constant. the amount of water and the amount of particles are the same inside and out. So this would be an isotonic solution. Iso means same. So isotonic, the amount of dissolved particles would be the same. So the cell would stay the same size. Water moves in and out at the same rate.